Hello, I've had a box of rocks in the post. I've heard that some people don't get excited by that sort of thing, but there's no accounting for taste. This box of rocks supposedly includes a Carboniferous jellyfish fossil, and also some mysterious things that the donor would like some advice on. So we're going to have a look, see what we can work out, and see if they make any sense. So first of all, a great big thank you to Gary, because he's the one who sent me these things, and yeah, I'm honoured. And some of this is really quite nice material. And Gary has been an amateur paleontologist for quite a long time and has actually published quite a few papers, mainly around crinoids, I believe. So yeah, he obviously knows what he's doing because each sample is wrapped up and has its own label with the locality, grid reference, the formation name, and even reference to an excursion guide so I can find out more information about it. So that's a sign of someone with a bit of experience. But I'm not going to do all of them today because there's quite a lot of things to get through, including a bunch of stuff from the Deer Hope Burn, which is Silurian, the Pentland Hills, which I've actually worked on a bit in the past because they're sponges there. But there's some things that I want to do in future videos, so I'll save for that one. That's quite fun. But there's a few in particular that, firstly, Gary has asked for my opinion on to see if I know what on earth is going on. And secondly, because there's something really quite extraordinary in here. So, first up, we have this little thin slab, which has actually been cut down, so it's presumably part of a much bigger slab at some point. And it is labelled as being from a place called Trian Quarry, which is Carboniferous, limestone, lots of little scattered fossils on the back, and also, well, a big white disc on the front. Odd, eh? This is something that I first saw specimens of in the Hunterian Museum, not on display, this is in Glasgow, quite a lot of years ago now, where they were sitting on the curator's desk with the label jellyfish, ? And we took one look at that and thought, what? Because jellyfish are extremely rare fossils. They're soft-bodied, of course, they rot away very quickly, and they don't have that much morphology to them either. Now, they can be preserved, and there are examples of fossil jellyfish. There's a review of fossil jellyfish that's it's been published, I think it's available. I'll check that and put the link in the description. But they are very interesting fossils, and you need really extraordinary conditions to preserve them. And this thing is one of several that are supposedly jellyfish, and apparently the paper is now under review. So I don't think this is the best specimen of them. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful to have any, but we're going to see what we can do with this, with things like cross-polarized light, low angle, see what we can get out of it, see if there's actually any way of telling for certain that this is a jellyfish, or whether it isn't. Let's have a look. The first problem we have to deal with is that this thing is too big for the microscope. I can't see it all at once. So what I'm going to have to do is use an auto-stitching function where I can take an image of the whole thing, combine it all together, and then we can look at it in an overall view. So I'm going to start off with using ordinary sort of light, so plain polarized, but nothing particularly exciting going on. And then we'll see what we can do from there. So image stitching, I'll make that start there. Well, what we can see here is not very much. There's faint darker bands going across it. That's just because I had it set on auto contrast, so it's adjusted itself as it went along. So don't worry about that, we'll fix that on the next one. But this is plain polarized light with a ring light, so the light is coming from all sides equally, and that means that there are no shadows. There's really not much to see there at all, is there? You can see the outline, you can see it's sort of slightly ragged at the edges, If we zoom in a bit, you can make out there's possibly some radial structure going on, but it's actually very hard to do much of anything with this. It's just very difficult to work out what is going on. And if we zoom in on the edges in different places, then you can see it seems to be a slightly lobed edge. It's not particularly clear. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to say much of anything from that. So let's do something else with the light instead, see if that helps. Right then, so this one is in cross-polarized light, and this tends to show differences in reflectivity, in texture, and so on, and composition to some extent as well. Things can sometimes be much more contrasting than you'd expect. And what we see here is that you've clearly got that disk. It's very obvious now. And in fact, the margin of it is a little bit irregular, but it's mostly smooth. It makes me wonder whether the lobate parts, especially on the right-hand side, are just damage. You can also now see that there is much more strongly some radial lines, particularly in the lower quadrant, where you've got white lines sort of radiating out from the centre towards the edge. And in this context, with the cross-polarized light, that means that probably there is a difference in thickness of the material. So you've got a, well, I'm not quite sure what this is preserved as, to be honest. It looks like calcium phosphate, which wouldn't be too unexpected. There's a lot of phosphatization in this low carboniferous succession in southern Scotland, where this is from. Not generally around here, but in this sort of general region, there's quite a lot of phosphatization. It's a black limestone, which tends to fit with that as well. And it's quite likely that this is something that has been phosphatized. And those lines are thickenings and thinnings in the material that has become phosphate. Now, whether that is soft tissue, organic material, is unclear, but that would be my guess. It's not necessarily very soft tissue, it's organic. Okay, in that case, what can we say about this? It's a disc, and we're starting to see radial lines. I think there was more there to see in low angle light, so we'll try that as well in a moment. But what I would hope to see here, if it was what I would think of as a jellyfish, so a Scyphozoan medusa, the typical sort of jellyfish, would be, rather than lots of radiating lines, I would expect to see some sort of tetraradial symmetry in the central part, especially 4 lobes, for example. That's not exclusively what you would expect for a Scyphozoan, a jellyfish, a true jellyfish, but that's what you might look at. Okay, but we're not seeing anything like that. What we're seeing instead is basically a fairly thin disc with these radial structures. Right, let's have a look with low angle light. For this I've needed to use the other microscope, so it looks a little different, but you can see immediately there are these radial ridges, and quite striking radial ridges. They all converge onto the central part, and then they seem to actually get wider outwards to some of them, to the upper right especially. But you've got a structure here which is certainly partly three-dimensional. Okay, this is interesting, because what we're looking at now is potentially a disc-shaped structure, which was probably originally organic, which has now been, I would guess, phosphatized, but I haven't got the analytical kit to be able to make sure that's the preservation. But you've got very strong radial ridges on it, and this is a surface feature. It's a sculpture, and it's actually the form of the upper surface, which is interesting because that's not what you would expect for a Scyphozoan. So my question now is the word jellyfish actually referring to something a little bit different? Because quite often people think of things like the Portuguese man of war as a jellyfish, when technically it isn't. it's another group of cnidarians, a siphonophore, and in some of these groups there are organic floats. These are called chondrophyllines. They have an organic discoidal float, usually with a radial structure on top of it. We happen to have been interested in these for a little while because they turn up in the Silurian rocks around here. And so we've actually got some to work on at the moment. But these definitely have that sort of look to it. I would, however, expect to see concentric ridges as well in a chondrophyllline float, and I'm not seeing anything quite like that. So, just stepping back completely, we have here a structure which has discoidal form, radiating ridges, and was probably organic. Probably. What are the options for something like that? One option is something like a chondrophyllline float. Another would be a coid sponge. These often are discoidal in their arrangement. They have radiating spicules that go out to the outer margin, and they look superficially similar to this. Now, I'm pretty certain this is not one of those, for various reasons. If it was, then the spicules should be visible projecting around the margin, and there's no sign of that. The other thing is that there is no explanation for the apparent thickening of these ridges going out to the side. That's not something you would see with spicules, so I am quite happy that this is not a coid sponge. Could it be anything else? Other options might be, well, we've only got the one piece, we don't have the counterpart. Theoretically, it could be something like the impression of the top of a solitary coral. I'm sure that is not the case, because the people who have seen these in the field, collected them, like Gary, would have known, obviously, if the counterpart was actually a coral. That's not going to happen. So we can rule that sort of thing out. Could it be some sort of mineral structure, something like a pyrite sun, where you have a radiating discoidal array of crystals, which have then been oxidized to give you this sort of white material? Maybe doesn't seem very plausible. So I'm not seeing any trace of pyrite here, not seeing any cube structures at a fine scale. I think this is genuinely a fossil, and based on this one specimen, I'd probably be going for chondrophyllline. I'm not saying that is the only possible explanation, but that fits with what I can see so far, and that may be, I don't know, what the paper is suggesting. So all I know is that there is a paper under review which is describing these as jellyfish in some form. If that means siphonophores, then I'm all on board with that. And I'm just going to have to wait for the paper to come out and see what exactly the verdict is and what the interpretation of these structures is, but I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you so much, Gary, for giving me one of these to be able to actually have a proper look at this, because it's a fascinating thing. I'm sure some of the others are much better preserved and show a lot more detail, but that is rather lovely in itself. Nice. Let's see what the next one's like. Right then, this is one that Gary wanted my opinion on, so let's have a look. It is from the Craighead Inlier of Girvan area, and this is from the Llandovery, so very early Silurian. And what we have, ooh, interesting. It's sandstone, definitely sandstone, and yeah, what we seem to be looking at here is a mass of little three-dimensional cylindrical hollows in the rock. And at first glance, they are completely three-dimensional, they're not flattened at all. They seem to have smooth surfaces. Some of them seem to intersect, or at least cut across each other. And some of them seem to have rounded ends. Okay, curious. We look in the side of the block, and we can see them in cross-section, but they seem to be a little less regular, and there are lots of little tiny pores in there as well. There's also an area off to this top part which is less weathered, I think, and these structures go across that, and yeah, okay, I think that might give us the answer, but let's have a look. Right. All right, so what do we got here? There are these cylindrical structures everywhere. Oh, that's interesting. You can see in here they're actually dimpled on the surface. When there's enough of a raking light across it, then we can see some sort of dimpling. Okay, this one doesn't seem to show that, but it might just be the light isn't well enough angled for it. Okay. Right, they look at first glance like something like bryozoans, but there just isn't anything like enough surface texture for them to be bryozoans. So, pretty sure we can rule that out. They've got slightly curved shapes in some places, but they're mostly straight-ish. Oh yeah, the curves again. We've got interesting sort of textures again, dimpled there, but very irregularly dimpled. The sediment is sand as well, so those very fine dimples that you can see in the middle of that are actually, I'm pretty certain, the sand grains. So you can see the sand there. Yeah. So the sand may be stuck together in places to form slightly larger clumps, but basically the very fine texture that we're seeing is sand grains. Alright, I want to go up to this far end here, because this is where it goes from the weathered area to unweathered, and now you can see straight away that these things are full of sediment. So when it goes into the unweathered bit, the sediment is still there, and you go into this part, and we can still see these structures in cross-section, and they're full of sediment. That's not a skeleton, it's not an agglutinated tube or anything like that, that is just packed full of sand. Let's just zoom into here, make sure, yeah, it looks like it. It's not as well cemented as the rest of the rock, I think it's fair to say. The blue colour of the surrounding matrix is some sort of cement, whereas these structures themselves are filled with sand that seems to be less well cemented. And that gives you most of the answer that we're looking for, because the structures are very clearly now burrows filled with sand. Okay, but there may be a little bit more to it than that. Firstly, why are they filled with sand rather than open? And why are they then not as cemented as the rest of it? Now we've noticed this dimpling of the surface, and that's another bit where it's even more pronounced and quite coarse. But there's a bit somewhere down here, I think, which I just saw as I was putting it under the microscope. There we go. Yeah, we've actually got two of these together. No, we haven't. Look at this junction between them is rounded. That might just be because the surface is flaked off on the top in such a way to make it look rounded, but it doesn't come out the other side. I think that is a branch. I think this is a burrow that is branching, and it's filled by sediment. But that sediment is not even. It's made up of lots of little cylindrical structures, is it? You can see them sort of stuck to the edge of the surface of the burrow. And then you have here, within the burrow, some of these structures are cylindrical as well. So it's actually densely packed by cylindrical things which are filling up the burrows. And those cylindrical things are made of sand, just stuck together. You can see the grains in there individually. Okay, that in itself is really interesting, but I think the combination of all this probably gives us a pretty good answer to what is going on. The answer's got to be, surely, that this was made by a deposit-feeding animal. So these are burrows that are going through just the sandy layer, actually. If you look in the cross-section, you can see it's only in the sort of sandier layer. The bit underneath it is finer. That's much more either very fine sand or probably a silt. So for some reason they wanted the sandy layer. Maybe that had lots of yummy nutrients in it. And what they've been doing is going through that sediment, ingesting the sediment as they go through, and then depositing it behind them again as soon as they have finished digesting whatever was organic inside it. So exactly the sort of thing that earthworms do. And they leave the casts on the surface, which is, but they also fill in the burrows quite often. And you can see this type of structure where an animal is just simply ingesting the sediment, digesting bits of it, leaving the rest behind it to fill up the burrows. And the little dimples on the surface of the burrows are the impressions of the pellets, the droppings effectively, where it's pushing them back against the side of the walls. So that's quite interesting. What was it? It was something with a circular cross-section. So I would guess we're looking at worm rather than arthropod. There's no sign of any scratches on the surface, for example. And probably something like an oligocete worm. So one of these annelids is the same group as the modern earthworms. Obviously not an earthworm, because I presume that this was a marine sediment. Don't know that for certain, have to look it up. But what was it again? The Mulloch Hill sandstone. Yeah, I'm pretty certain that's marine in the Cretaceous layer, but we can check that and see if there's a possibility of it being freshwater. But yeah, I think that is my best guess, Gary. Hopefully that doesn't contradict anything you know about them, but it looks to me like that is deposit feeder burrows in a sandstone which for some reason have not been cemented in the burrows or in the burrow infills as much as they are in the surrounding sediment. So you end up with, on weathering, the rock itself stays intact and the burrow fill just weathers out and disappears, which is why you're left with these interesting tubes. Alright, we got one more to look at, and that is, we've got a lead on this one. Found several of these coprolites with a big question mark. From the Fishbed Formation, Silurian of Muirkirk. Okay, this looks very different. Right, what we've got here is another little sawn down block, and there are a couple of slightly reflective orange elongate structures on there, orange or even black. You can see there's a sort of dark line on the surface, which is going to need the microscope for that, but that's the sort of thing the cross polars are made for. Okay, let's see what we've got. So this little orange patch, also on top of a sort of darker silver area, looks carbonaceous. Put the polarizer in, yeah, that's carbon. Okay. So we've got an area with sort of iron oxide and carbon. And then this is the main thing, which is this quite long area that goes across the entire slab, almost. Again, polarizer out. It's a combination of, again, sort of reflective carbon film with bits of iron oxide, so maybe there was some pyritization going on there originally. If we zoom in to as far as we can go on this one, yeah, we've got little grains within the iron oxide. So that could be where there were pyrite flamboids or tiny crystals. We can't see the detail enough in this microscope to be able to be certain. You'd need SEM for that, really. But that could well be something like an array of little pyrite crystals on the surface of something organic, which is then weathering to give us the yellow limonite, probably, all over the surface. Okay, shape of it. It is... Ooh, it gets much wider at that end. That's interesting. See here, without that iron staining so visible, it's much harder to see the outlines, but putting in the polarizer shows you this black edge. Does it have little spikes on? It does seem to have little spikes on. Interesting. Okay. And then it's relatively slender to this end. Now, is that a boundary? It looks like it might be to me. That could be something like a segment boundary. If we were looking at something like, I don't know, an arthropod limb, then that's the sort of structure we'd be looking for. This should be subdivided in that case. And that, less convincing, because although there's a line going across, it doesn't really match up with any sort of step in the outline. There are some black fibrous sort of arrangements, or just linear structures within it as well, so there's a little bit more to it than just a simple film. Go towards that end. Again, that could be some sort of segmentation boundary, or it could just be a fracture. Hard to tell on that one. Could just be a fracture. Then it's broken at that point. I think the rock is broken around it, and then it ends up disappearing off the edge like that. Okay, that's quite nice. These little dark spots could well be some sort of secondary mineral growth. Or it could be tubercles, because they look like they are indeed made of carbon. Without the cross polars, you don't see any separate mineral there. So that could well be thickenings of carbon. So you'd be looking there at a tuberculate structure on the cuticle, where it's much thicker carbon on those lumps. Do we see any on the outline? Maybe. Nothing very convincing. Okay. On that edge, that's a broken edge, so it's not really the outline. Yeah, that in this area it does look like tubercles. How far up does that go? Yeah, not very. No, they're still there as well. Yeah, they're smaller, I think, if anything. But yeah, it does seem that there are tubercles on this bit. I'd say there's some linear features here as well. Maybe, yeah, sort of transverse, very faint lines. Not totally convincing, but in that area, I think there's a transverse structure in there. Interesting. But that comes to what looks like a slightly ragged or spiky edge. And that is a separate structure from that. Which has these sort of gaps in the limonite film, those little spaces which we thought might be surrounding originally pyrite crystals or something like that. But we don't see the thickenings of the carbon. Right, so that means we've actually got two distinct structures here with separate textures. That one is much more ornamented. It seems to have these tubercles and some transverse lines on it. This one, much less so, seems to be much simpler, but it does potentially have multiple segments. So I'd be looking at a segment boundary there, possibly, there, That looks reasonably convincing actually, because you've got these, what could be a sort of spinose margin. Again, put the polarizer in so it shows up better. That could be a little spine overlapping the join. Maybe that's an interesting deviation on the edge. That could just be something a bit torn and fragmented because it seems to be very irregular. And then possibly a boundary there. Is this tuberculate again? Could be. Yeah, that looks more like the tubercles again. Okay, so and then you go up to this area where again there's little spikes, and then it disappears. So we have this structure which does not look to me like a coprolite, so a fossilized dropping at all. I don't see any fragments of things in it, I don't see any phosphatization, there's no 3D-ness to it even. It's basically a carbonaceous film which has been partly pyritized and preserved with as a sort of flattened film. Okay, so my take on this little beauty is that it's not a coprolite, it's something much more interesting to some extent. Coprolites can be really interesting as well, so they tell you all about the ecology of an ecosystem and so on. But in this case, what we've got is, I think, organic remains, something that was quite tough. It's not an alga. This is something which had a much denser and smoother structure, which is nonetheless flattened. You would expect something like that to probably be arthropod, which is why I immediately started looking for segmentation, and it looks like there might be segmentation. So I don't know whether this formation has bits of Eurypterid in, sea scorpions for example, but this is, yeah, the fish bed formation. You very often in the Silurian, is this Silurian? It is Silurian. In the late Silurian at least, in the fish beds, which do tend to be more in the later Silurian into the Devonian, you do often get bits of Eurypterid in the same beds. So to me, I think I would be looking at this and thinking which bit of Eurypterid might it plausibly be. And there could be other arthropods as well. The ornament is not diagnostic, it's tuberculate. There are quite a lot of things that have tubercles. But this is possibly a jointed limb, maybe. It's very slender for anything else. And that limb would be a centimetre or so long, so you're probably looking at an arthropod, something this size at a guess. That's not a guarantee, because it's a small piece. But if I was out collecting this, I would be having a good look at what the possibilities were. And at the moment, I can't see anything else obvious other than a substantial arthropod. So I'd probably be going back there and trying to find bits of head shield, prosoma, segments, anything which looked clearly like it could be a recognisable arthropod, and which you could then do a lot more with. I mean, it's possible that the arrangement of the spines on here would mean something to you, Eurypterid specialist, which I am not. But going by the preservation, the detail that we can see on it, even in a few minutes, it looks like arthropod to me is the best bet. I can't think of anything else that would be plausible for an interpretation for something of this nature. Well, that was fun. There's nothing quite like the excitement of getting some rocks, whether you collect them yourself or someone's given them to you, which might have interesting things in, and getting to explore them for the first time. Because you just never know what is going to turn up. And this hasn't disappointed. So we've got, in my view, a possible chondrophyline, Some burrows with really interesting preservation, backfilled burrows filled with pellets made by deposit feeder, and then what to me is probably a chunk of arthropod. I'm still trying to second guess myself. What else could it be? Nautiloid, maybe, with the calcite dissolved and just getting the periostracum preserved. But then that sculpture doesn't look like a nautiloid. You don't really get tuberculate nautiloids. So I don't think that makes sense either. So I don't think plant or algal material makes sense for this type of preservation. It tends to be more like coal, sort of black impressions, whereas this is very much reflective carbon film, the sort of thing that you get from originally chitinous stuff. Yeah, I still think arthropod. But thank you very much, Gary. That is lovely. And I hope that's also been interesting for everyone else to see the sort of process you go through, trying to make sense of little scraps of fossil, not in order necessarily to give us the absolute answer, but to see where we go from there. And in many cases, that is back to the site to get a better one. But in terms of understanding things like this mass of burrows, you'd be really interested in what made them and what was there in the rest of the ecosystem. So looking for trace fossils in the beds above and below this, for example, see how consistent the ecology is from one layer to the next. Think about how you get such a densely burrowed little layer of sandstone, what they were eating, what organic material was there in that sediment. Is it possible to dissolve a little bit and see if there's remains of algae, for example? All sorts of possibilities to consider. And everything that you get feeds into the greater understanding of whatever deposit you're looking at. So I never dismiss any fossil, no matter how mundane it might be, because it all tells you something else about how the ecosystems are structured, how you can really start to understand what was going on in these little pockets of the ancient world that we still have preserved. It's such a wonderful subject to be able to try to make sense of these things. And yes, we do on here quite a lot of the glamorous stuff like the Ediacaran or Burgess Shale type faunas, but that's not to dismiss the ordinary fossil deposits, because what we're trying to do here is understand the history of life, and it's so easy to forget about all the more mundane stuff just because it's not so glamorous, it's not so exciting. But it should be in some ways, because all of these things are telling us about what life was like in the ancient past. I'll leave it there and work out what on earth we're going to do next time. I think there might be some graptolites making a comeback if Lucy gets her work done in the meantime, but we'll see you soon. Bye for now.